poorly written, but I think I can try to simplify the way you approach it. The way I always like to say is, the big picture is, I mean, first of all, there's two things here. There's two completely separate things: fire hardening and defensible space. They just happen to be on the same form, right? I mean, they're actually two different laws, two different things combined into one form. The first three paragraphs are the fire hardening. The fourth paragraph is the defensible space. And the fifth paragraph, as I mentioned, we haven't got there yet, is sort of a combination of the two. What I always like to say, put it in perspective. Okay, I mean, as you all know, we're in this place, California, where there's a lot of fires. And obviously, you want to do whatever you can to protect yourself. And two things people can do are fire hardening their home, you know, no more wood roof and dual pane windows and stuff like that. And the other thing you can do is make sure you have sufficient defensible space. Now, the second part is actually not just something you can do, it's something you have to do, right? It's required by law. So even if this form never happened or this law never happened, it's still a great idea to fire harden your house, and you have to have defensible space. This law doesn't change anything. I mean, this law doesn't make you do anything you didn't have to do before as far as defensible space. You're supposed to have defensible space, period. What this law does is really just sort of bringing to people's attention this important stuff, because maybe they didn't think about it, maybe they didn't know about it, but now it's right in their face. In other words, what the government did is they decided, we're going to use the event of a sale to trigger some things that people have to do that they didn't have to do. In other words, you always should have done this anyway, but now when the property changes hands, there's some type of information that has to be passed along. Now, first part, 1, 2, 3, the home hardening, that's a pure disclosure. Nobody has to do anything other than disclose. As you know, ever since January 1st, paragraph 1, 2, 3 used to be a different form called the FHDS, the Home Fire Hardening Disclosure and Advisory. That form's gone, and that form was put onto this form. So paragraph 1, 2, 3 of this form is basically the old FHDS, all right? And all it is a disclosure. Now, so point number one is, this whole form is only necessary if your listing is in a high or very high fire zone. Now, you may tell me your entire area is a high or very high fire zone. Some places that's true. I don't keep track of that. But the point is, this is a new mandatory form. And believe it or not, we haven't had a new disclosure form in California for about 15 years. For the last 15 years, if people asked me, what are the mandatory disclosure forms I need when I sell a house, I would have told you there are 5 things. Number 1, order an NHD report. Number 2, do a TDS unless it's exempt. Number 3, do a seller property questionnaire unless it's exempt. Number 4, do a lead paint form if it's pre-78. And number 5, send those 4 booklets, those earthquake booklet, environmental hazard booklet, home energy booklet, lead paint booklet, unless it's exempt. And the TDS and the SPQ and the booklets, you are exempt if it's a probate, REO, bankruptcy, or trust sale, unless the trustee used to be on title. Lead paint form, you're never exempt, but if the house is, if the house was not built before 78, you don't have to do it. And NHD is always required, no matter what, no exceptions. But so basically 5 things. Well, now there's 6 things. This is the 6th mandatory disclosure. It is connected with the TDS and the SPQ and the booklets. So if you're exempt from a TDS, you're exempt from this. REO, probate, bankruptcy, sale by a trust if the trustee never owned the property. Okay. But the thing that's different about this form than the other 5 disclosure forms is this one is only required if your listing is in a high or very high fire zone. If you're in a moderate fire zone or if you're in no fire zone at all, the form is not required. TDS is required in all fire zones. SBQ is required in all fire zones. This form is only required high or very high. So there's one thing, the first thing you have to do now before you didn't have to do before is every time you take a listing, you got to figure out if you're in a high or very high fire zone. How do I do that? Well, remember one of the 5 things I mentioned you have to do is the NHD report. The NHD report has 2 fire zones on the main page. One is a very high and one says wildland fire area. If neither box is checked, you're not in a fire zone. You don't need this form. If the very high box is checked on the NHD, well, this form is required. What if the very high box is not checked, but the wildland fire box is checked? What does that tell you? That tells you you're either in a high or a moderate. But the form is only required if you're in a high. So how do I know if I get an NHD and they check the wildland fire area? How do I know if I'm in a high or a moderate? You just have to push a little further with your NHD company. They will be able to tell you, and they will be very happy to tell you which one you're in. Now, I know some brokers provide this form whether they're in a high or a moderate. But if you only want to provide it when you have to, you only have to do it if it's in a high. So your NHD company just told you, yep, you're in a high or you're in a very high. So this form is required. All right, so now step 1, I figured out whether I got to do this form. So I pull out the form. First, we're going to do the first 3 paragraphs, the fire hardening. Now, to complicate your life, as it says in the very first sentence there, A1, this part of the form is only required if the house was built before January 1, 2010. So if your house is listed in a high or very high, but it was built after 2010, you can skip the first 3 paragraphs. It's really not required unless not only is it in a high or very high, but also it's built before 2010. What if it's built before 2010? Then your seller has to answer the 6 questions in 3B. What if it was not built? What if it was built after 2010? The form is still required because paragraph 4 is still relevant, but you can skip paragraph 3. So if you're in a high or very high, the form is definitely required. But if the property was built after 2010, the only relevant part of the form is paragraph 4. You can sort of skip the first 3. Now, what's paragraph 2 about? That's when the seller decides to provide this form, even though you're not in a high or very high. Because some sellers, for some reason, some brokers, for some reason, want to provide this form as information to the buyer, even though they're not in a high or very high. If that's the case, you're going to check the box in 2B. But you don't have to do that. The form is only required if you're in a high or very high. But if you want to give the form anyway, just because you're in a moderate, or some people just give this form every single deal. I don't know why they do that, but they do. Then you could check the box in paragraph 2. But of course, if you're not in a high or very high, the seller doesn't have to answer those questions in 3B. So to try to summarize that, the form is only required in a high or very high. If you want to provide it, even though you're not in a very high or high, check the box in 2B. And if the house was built before 2010, the seller does have to answer those 6 questions. Do they have vents on the roof open more than 1/8 of an inch? Do they have wood roof? Do they have combustible landscaping? Do they have single pane? Do they have, in other words, these are all things that you'd recommend not having on your property when you're in a fire zone. That doesn't mean it's illegal though. If you got an older house, you have single pane windows, you have wood roof, you tell the buyer, you know, I got these things. The buyer says, oh, I want you to get rid of it. Seller says, I don't want to. You can buy the house and change it yourself if you want, but I'm not changing. Seller doesn't have to do anything. All they have to do is disclose. Okay? So that's paragraph 1, 2, 3. That's the fire hardening. And everything I just said has been true for 6 months. Okay? Everything I said has been true. Thank you for scrolling down to the more complicated paragraph. Perfect, right there. Paragraph 4 is the defensible space part. This is the part that took effect July 1st. And this is the somewhat confusing, but let's try to make it simple here. Okay. So, as I said, as it says in paragraph 4A, there's already a law in California, Public Resources 4291, that requires you to have 100 foot of defensible space. That's the law now. That's the law. It's been for law. Nothing is new. That's the law. Plus, what does it also say in 4A? Some local governments have their own local law for vegetation management. I'm pretty sure you're in one of those areas where there's a local law. Napa has one, Lake Tahoe has one, Sonoma has one, Mendocino has one, Marin has one. There are a couple other places, I believe, but I'm not sure that your area has a local vegetation management law. Okay, fine. That's great. But what do I have to do now that I didn't have to do before? In other words, before this law ever came about, before July 1st, if you're in a high or very high, you have to comply with the PRC code and have 100 foot. And if your local law requires something else, if you have a local law that requires 200 foot rather than 100 foot, or they require a different standard, they require more trees to be cut or whatever, you are already required to do that. And you know what? Long before July 1st, CAL FIRE could just show up at your property, or a local fire company could show up at your property, and if you're not in compliance, they could fine you. That's nothing new. What's new here? What's new here is when you sell a house, somebody's got to get some documentation. You already should be in compliance. You don't have to get into compliance. You should be in compliance already, but you have to get some documentation that you're in compliance. And that's triggered by a sale, which is why this is a form that goes with a sale. So when you sell a house in a high or very high, doesn't matter when it was built. Remember, that deals with the home hardening. Paragraph 4 applies to all sales in a high or very high, regardless of when the property was built. And you have 4 possible choices. So when the seller gives this form to the buyer, either they're going to check B2, they're going to check B3, they're going to check B4, or they're not going to check anything, and we default to B1. So this is what the listing agent and the seller have to figure out. How do I complete 4B? I mean, you've already figured out you're in a high or very high, which is why you have this form. Now you got to figure out what box to check. Well, how do I figure that out? Well, if you look at B1 and 2, they said there's no local ordinance. 3 and 4 says there is a local ordinance. So first thing you have to figure out is, does my area have a local vegetation management or defensible space ordinance? So remember, the first thing you had to do is figure out what zone you're in. Now you got to figure out if there's a local ordinance. But you know what? Just because there's a local ordinance doesn't mean you necessarily are going to be checking 3 or 4. Let's look at 3 there. Local vegetation management or other defensible space which permits compliance after close. Number 4, local management says requires compliance prior to close. So number 1, you got to figure out if you have a local law, but number 2, does your local law require you to do anything in connection with a sale? I mean, I was talking to the people in Marin, Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino. They all have a local law, and their local law requires tighter standards for defensible space, but none of their local laws require them to do anything in context of a sale. So even though Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, Marin, they all have local laws, they still don't check 3 or 4. You only check 3 or 4 if you have a local law and the local law says you have to do something. Now, there are some local laws that actually say, oh, you want to sell this house? You have to bring your house into compliance with the local law before sale, and you can't sell it without doing that. If that would be you, you'd check paragraph 4. Or there are some local laws that require the buyer to do something after close. So you got 2 months after close to come into compliance. So if you have a local law that requires the seller to do something, or a local law that requires the buyer to do something, then you'll check 3 or 4. And the seller is telling the buyer, if it's number 4, the seller's saying, I'm going to take care of this, I got you. Or if it's number 3, the seller says, buyer, you got to take care of this. But as I said, there aren't many places like that. Lake Tahoe is one. But let's say there is no local law, or there is a local law, but the local law doesn't require you to do anything. Then we go back to B1 or 2. And I think 95% of the sales in California that are in a high or very high zone are going to be B1 or 2. So let's say we figured out there's no local law, or there is a local law, but it doesn't require me to do anything other than have a certain type of defensible space. So we go to B1 or 2. The listing agent says to the seller, for some reason in the last 6 months, have you actually had some inspector out to your property doing an inspection and they told you you're okay with defensible space? And the seller says, yep, they were out here about 4 months ago. Sure enough. If that's the case, the seller is going to check box number 2, and they're going to provide this documentation to the buyer. What if the seller says, no, nobody's been here the last 6 months. I have no documentation. Well, that means you're not going to check 2, and we default to 1. And it says the buyer shall obtain documentation with the state law within a year after close. Okay. Peter, very good question. B2 says there's no local law, but there is the state law. So by checking 4B2, you're saying there's no local law that requires me to do something special at point of sale, which means we default to the state law. The state law, which applies to every single sale in a high or very high, the state law requires the buyer to do number 1. Now, before I go any further, something tells me that in your area, they come out and do regular inspections every 6 months. Is that true? Was that only true in Big Bear? I mean, they don't do that. Okay, because I was talking to Big Bear and they were telling me, oh, every 6 months, they automatically come out to your property, do a defensible space inspection. If that were the case, every single seller in that area would have in their possession documentation they received in the last 6 months that they would just do B2. But if your area, okay, so you guys are telling me maybe once a year.
Yeah, we have annual weed abatements.
Okay. When they come out once a year, do they give you some type of form saying, yeah, we checked you and you're all good? Or do they only do something if you're bad, right? If you're good, they probably don't give you anything, right? They probably say, yep, you're good. I'm suspecting, that's what Ruben's telling me, no. So I'm suspecting from what you're telling me, you guys in your area, in your part of the county, you're under B1. You know what I mean? You're here, you don't have any local law that requires you to do some form, and you don't have anyone coming out there automatically giving you documentation. So the only time you're going to be doing B2 is if your seller, for some reason, was audited or something, and they got something in writing from CAL FIRE or local saying, yep, you're good.
I think some people receive a letter. Some people have had people come out to their properties. So it's just different parts of the mountain or who.
Now, does the letter say, we've checked you out and you're good? Or does the letter say, Ruben's shaking his head saying the letter probably says you're out of compliance?
They need to say, yeah, they say that you're out of compliance, what you need to do.
Right. In other words, what you're telling me is all of your sales are going to be B1. You don't have a local law requiring documentation, and none of your sellers are going to have documentation that says you're in compliance. They're only might have some say you're not in compliance, which means all of your sales are B1. So that means listing agent, you're just going to give this form to the buyer, not checking any of the boxes. You're going to take care of paragraph 3, depending on how old the house is. But when it comes to defensible space, you're defaulting to B1, which is most of California. I don't think anyone understands this. This big new law is almost always going to be B1, which means the seller doesn't have to do anything but provide the form. So Amy says if your office is requiring you to check B3, the only reason I would check B3 is if the local law in that area said there's a requirement under local law that the buyer has to do something. And I don't think you've told me that if that's true, yeah. But I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't think you have a local ordinance there. I mean, some local ordinance says buyer within 2 months after close, you got to get all taken care of and get some documentation from that you're in compliance. You guys have just told me you don't do that. So assuming that's the case, let's go back to B1. B1 means under state law, every single buyer who buys this house in this high or very high, they have a year after close to go obtain documentation of compliance. So basically, the buyer has just received a form, and B2, 3, and 4 were not checked. So they're getting this form that says B1. So far, I've just been talking to listing agents. I've been saying, figure out if you're in a high or very high, figure out when the house was built, figure out if the local ordinance requires you to do anything, figure out if the seller has documentation. Assuming, yes, we're in a high, very high. No, there's no local ordinance requiring us to do anything. No, the seller doesn't have documentation. We go to B1. And we give the form to the buyer's agent who gives it to the buyer. Now I'm talking to you as a buyer's agent. You just represented a buyer on a sale, and they receive this form. You have a duty to your buyer to basically explain the form that they just got, just like you have to explain the TDS and the lead paint, etc. But it's very simple what you're going to say to your buyer. Hey, buyer, look at this form you just got. You see 4A there? You've just agreed, I'm sorry, 4B1, you've just agreed that you're going to do something within a year. I just want to point that out to you. The buyer's going to read it and say, it says, I have to obtain documentation of compliance within a year. Then they're going to look at you and say, well, what does that mean? How do I do that? Here's your answer. You say to your buyer, sometime in the next year, pick up the phone and call CAL FIRE. Call the local office of CAL FIRE. They'll be ready for your call. CAL FIRE is aware of this law. They've hired a whole bunch of new inspectors. So you're going to call CAL FIRE and say, hey, I just bought a house. Can you please schedule someone to come out and check me out for defensible space? Now, CAL FIRE might say yes, but what if CAL FIRE says, no, you're not, this is not, your house is not in our jurisdiction. This is not a state fire area, you're in a local area. So we're not going to come out. Then what do you do? Well, then you're going to tell the buyer, if that happens, call your local fire company. Say, hey, local company, since I'm in a local zone here, so this new law says I got to call you up and you got to try to schedule an appointment for you to come out to check me out and give me a statement of compliance. What if the local company says, we don't do that? We do this annual thing, but we don't just come out upon request. And we don't give documentation that you're in compliance. If they say that, you tell your buyer, tell them, get the name of the person who told you that, write that down, file it away, you're done. CAL FIRE says they're not coming out. The local company says they're not coming out. You've done your best, you are done. You are in compliance. That's all you got to do. Couple of questions. Should the buyer try to arrange this before close? Well, remember the purchase contract says in paragraph 12, inspections, buyer cannot call any government employee out to do an inspection. So they really have to wait until close. Of course, if you want to be a nice, helpful agent, you can probably call up. You can call on your own you probably have to do this once or twice, and then you'll know. Call CAL FIRE and say, hey, I got a client about to buy a house in this area. Do you come out and do these inspections? And they may tell you, no, we don't do it. That's a local area. And then you may, as the good buyer's agent, call them up, call the local agency, local fire company, and say, hey, I got a buyer about to buy a house. Do you come out and do these compliance inspections? They may say no. So you could actually tell your buyer, I already checked for you. It looks like no. But to be safe, you'd say, to comply with the law, buyer, after close, make the phone call. But what I'm saying is, don't schedule. Buyer doesn't have the right to schedule this prior to close without the seller's permission. That's what it says in paragraph 12 of the purchase contract. Maybe the seller's okay with that. Seller's probably going to say, nah, it's not my problem. I don't want to get cited before I even sell you the house. So no, I do not give you permission to do this. Close escrow, then do it, because that's what B1 says. You're going to do it after close. Okay? Now here's another issue. Buyer buys the house and says, okay, so I call these guys up and they come out and they find out I'm in violation. Now what? Well, they might fine you. The buyer said, I don't want that to happen. Well, maybe the smart thing for a buyer to do before they call them out is to check out their property, make sure it's in compliance. Either they can read PRC code, or if there's a local law that has a standard, or they can hire a private individual, a private inspector, come out to their property, figure out if they need any trees cut or anything, put the property in compliance, and then call CAL FIRE and say, yeah, now I want you to come out. You know what I mean? Because you've already checked it out to make sure you're in compliance. Or you can just take a chance and call them up and hope you're in compliance. You see what I mean? So, another issue. Seller fills out this form, gives it to the buyer. Buyer reads it, or the buyer's agent explains B1. The buyer says, you know something? I don't like that. I do not want to do that within the next year. I don't want to take that responsibility. So I refuse to sign the form. What do you do with a buyer? You give them this form. B1 is relevant, and they refuse to sign it. What does a seller do now? Yeah, you could give them a notice to perform, absolutely. Because in other words, the purchase contract does say buyer is required to sign and return all disclosures. You're exactly right. So just like the TDS, they have to sign and return it, the NHD, they have to sign and return these forms. And if they don't do it, the seller doesn't have to sell. You can send them a notice to perform. Hey, you're supposed to sign this form and return it. But what if the buyer still says, you know what, I refuse to sign. I'm not signing. Well, then we look at the seller. What do you do? Well, seller, does that mean I should just not sell to them? Should I cancel the deal? In other words, is there any risk as a seller to close the deal even though the buyer didn't sign this form? I actually asked CAL FIRE. I said, what do you think, CAL FIRE? Because you're the ones enforcing this law. If the deal closes and the buyer refuses to sign, are you going to go back after the seller for selling a house without getting the buyer to sign the form? You know what CAL FIRE said? They said, we'll get back to you on that. So here's conservative gov's conservative advice to a seller. If you want to be safe until we find out otherwise, insist that the buyer sign the form. And if they don't sell it to them. Sell to somebody else. In this market, you can probably find another buyer who's willing to sign the form. But if every buyer is going to not sign this form, I guess the seller can make a business decision. How much of a risk do I have? I'm not sure they have any risk at all because CAL FIRE wouldn't tell me. I think what everyone needs to remember is whether you're a seller or a buyer, CAL FIRE can come out and inspect you anytime they want. And you guys apparently get a local annual inspection anyway. And if you're in violation, you're always going to be at risk. So you should always not be in violation. But anyway, that's how this form works. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. Now let's look at number 5. Number 5 is almost never going to be relevant. Some people get confused by this and they say, oh, number 5 means seller has to go out and get a final inspection report every time they sell a house. Absolutely not. Seller doesn't have to do anything. All the seller has to do is answer the questions in paragraph 3 if it's older than 210, and then just provide the rest of the form, but they're not checking any boxes anyway. Seller has done. Look at what paragraph 5 says. Seller has obtained a final inspection report. In other words, if the seller has obtained a final inspection report, they're going to give it to the buyer. 99% of your sellers aren't going to have a final inspection report. Who has a final? Basically, if you built the house, if you're the person who actually built this house in this fire zone, in order to get the permit, and you built it in the last 10 years or so, you probably had to get this defensible space home hardening report. You couldn't have got it. You couldn't have built the house without doing it. Or maybe in the last 10 years, you did a major remodel. To get the permit for that, you probably had to get a defensible space home hardening report in order to get the permit. So in other words, paragraph 5 is rarely going to be relevant. It's only going to be relevant for the very few sellers who really had to get that type of report in order to get a permit. That's what that's referring to. So I don't think it's going to be very common that your seller actually has that type of final inspection report. I think most of your sellers, I think a lot of you are in a higher, very high, so you may have to use this form quite a bit. So probably most of your sellers are going to be filling out paragraph 3, answering those 6 questions. In paragraph 4B, they're not going to be checking any boxes. And in paragraph 5, they're not going to be checking that either. I think that's what your normal sale is going to be. And then your buyers are going to be having to do something within the next year. Every single buyer who buys in a high or very high is required to comply with B1. And the only way there are 2 ways: that you call CAL FIRE or you call your local. CAL FIRE has already told us we're going to do these inspections. All you got to do is ask. We're going to do it. But if it's not in a CAL FIRE jurisdiction, it's up to the local fire company if they want to do it. And I think what you guys were telling me is somebody there does something annually. Is that CAL FIRE or is that some local?
It's county.
Okay, so your county actually does this.
So
but they don't, but what you guys keep telling me is when the county does it, they don't provide any documentation of compliance. All they do is tell you as if you're not in compliance. So leads to another question.
Can I make a comment on that?
Sure.
Okay, so I used to have an Allstate insurance agency up here on the mountain. And when Allstate wanted to slow the growth of high-risk areas, they were requiring people to get letters of compliance, but the fire department wasn't going to go out and do that. So a lot of agents, that was their way of like getting people to cancel without going through the Department of Insurance and all that. Right. So anyway, what the county does is they'll send you a letter that you're not in compliance.
Right.
But then you do the work, and if it's still not in compliance, then they give you a notice that they're going to come do it for you if it's not done by a certain date.
Right.
So I just think they're really reluctant to do notices of compliance, because if for some reason they miss something, now they're held liable if the house burns down.
Right, right. Makes sense. So I guess what that's telling me is when you take a listing, you ask your seller, did you ever get this statement of non-compliance that you haven't taken care of yet? And let's say, yep, I did. A month ago, they came out, I haven't taken care of it yet, but now I want to sell. Well, that I think is a material fact they're going to have to tell the buyer. Not only are you going to give them this form telling them they got to go out and get documentation, you're also going to tell them, and by the way, me, the seller, apparently this property is not in compliance. So I'm actually selling you this house that's not in compliance, which you're allowed to do. But you raised, Amy, one other thing, which I think is the most important thing that I saved for last, which I'm concerned about. What's to stop every single insurance company in California to say, I don't care about this new law. We're just not going to give you insurance unless you prove to us you're in compliance. Or we're going to come out and do that. Now, apparently this isn't happening. But that's what I've always been worried about, is that insurance companies are going to say, well, obviously, unless you're paying cash, I guess, but you still want insurance. For the loan, you need insurance. Everyone wants insurance when you buy a house. Everyone wants fire insurance. So maybe insurance companies are just going to start saying, we could care less about this new law. We're not going to insure properties that aren't in compliance. If
And
that
that's what they-
happens,
that's
if that
what they
happens,
did.
sellers are going to have to start doing it anyway, because otherwise they're not going to be able to sell the house. Right?
And Gov, that's what they did in around 2009.
Yeah,
That's when they were requesting these letters of compliance.
right. But you're saying they're not
So-
doing it now.
I don't think they are, because they pretty much weeded out everybody in their high risk book of business.
Okay. So you think most of the properties now that come on the market are pretty much in compliance?
Not necessarily.
Okay. Well, the point is, I think what you're telling me is just something I'm just worried about. But you're telling me that insurance companies are allowing you to close a deal and giving you insurance without demanding some statement of compliance, right? You're closing deals without statements of compliance,
Right.
right?
Because what I've been doing is I've been marking item 4.3.
4B3?
Yeah. Where it would be the buyer that does this. But
Yeah.
no one's really coming out to do anything to enforce it.
Yeah. See, that's the thing. This law was written so poorly. 4B1 and 4B3 sort of look like the same thing. 4B3 says buyer shall obtain compliance. B1 says buyer shall obtain compliance. You know what the difference between B1 and B3 is? B3 is if there's a local law requiring the buyer to do anything. And I don't think you have such a law.
So our local law would be, the most local law we have would be with the county.
Right. And the county doesn't require you to get documentation, do they?
No, they only come out and
Right.
tell you that
So-
you need to do it. So we
Exactly.
shouldn't even worry about it then.
Right. I'm
Okay,
saying
I like
all
that.
of your deals are going to be B1. Every deal you have, from what you're telling me, is a B1, where buyer is agreeing to do something within a year after close.
Oh yeah, because B1 says there is no local ordinance requiring proof of compliance.
Right.
So yeah, nobody's requiring proof of compliance.
Right. You guys are a
yeah.
B1 area. You
That just
guys
made
are
this easy.
B1.
Well, that seems to be super different from Riverside County, because if you're selling in Idlewild, they're literally putting it in their offers when they write their offer that the seller will comply with this. And then you have to do an LE 100, which is the checklist A through O of all of the items that are required to get that. So it is like a sign off. And then they
Yeah.
have local companies that come in and they'll do it for you if you can't. And CAL FIRE was shut down until July 1st because of coronavirus. They wouldn't come out anyway.
Right.
So I think that'll come down the pipe in
Yeah.
San Bernardino County also.
I wouldn't be surprised. But right now, apparently, I don't think you got to worry about that in San Bernardino County.
We also have a question from Peter. We live here with properties from 1940 that are close to each other. Pretty much the properties don't have 100 feet to
Yeah.
create that defensible space. So what
And
is
by
it?
the way, that's a very good question. You're only responsible for your own property. I mean, if you don't have 100 foot from your house to the border, you just take care of your house. Which leads to another question. What about your neighbor? Your no good neighbor doesn't comply with defensible space. So your no good neighbor is 50 feet away from your house and they got all this vegetation they shouldn't be having there. What do you do about your no good neighbor? Turn them in. Call up CAL FIRE, call up, say, hey, I'm in danger here by this neighbor of mine who's not in compliance. You might want to come out and check them out. But apparently what you guys are telling me is they come out anyway, once a year. So hopefully they'll be noticing that. So you're right. I mean, you can't, when you live next door to someone, 100 feet means if you have 100 feet, so you do what you got to do. So anyway, bottom line is, I think there's a huge confusion about this law because I think even not in Riverside County, as you just mentioned, Tony, all over the state, people are reading this law as that the seller has to do something. And what I'm telling you is the seller doesn't have to do anything. They got to answer the 6 questions in paragraph 3. And then they got to figure out which box to check in paragraph 4. But in a couple areas like Lake Tahoe, yeah, the seller does have to do something. And maybe in Riverside, as Tony just said, and we can't keep track of what's required where. We're trying to come up with some type of spreadsheet. We haven't done that yet. Anyway, but a lot of people think, oh, every deal, no matter where I am, seller has to do something. And the answer is no. Seller generally doesn't have to do anything. It's usually the buyer who has to do something within a year after close. That's the big sort of news here. And I think the bigger news is, the important thing is not this new law. The important thing is the property should always be in compliance anyway for everybody's safety. I mean, whether you're a seller or a buyer or you're not even selling, don't you want to make sure you have, for your own safety, don't you want to have defensible space just to protect yourself? So
I think the problem is a lot of the homes in the mountain are just, they're never, ever going to be able to be compliant because some of their rules are super tight. I have 2 trees that are so close to my house, but if you follow the rules and trim them from 10 feet from your chimney, I will have a tree that looks like a Q-tip. It'll have a little tiny top on it. I mean, it'll never be compliant.
yeah. And I don't know the reaction of, what's the reaction today when they come out once a year? What did they say? Do they cite you? Do they?
It seems like they're more worried about ground cover
Okay.
than the other stuff, and sometimes tree branches close to the roof, but
Yeah.
that's all I've ever gotten. But
I mean, you guys have been dealing with this a lot more than most people have because you have some type of annual thing that's already happening. So you guys are used to this. You guys are dealing with this. You understand what's going on. The only new thing for you guys really is buyers are promising to reach out in the next year. But why are they reaching out if they're coming out already? So but I think maybe what you're telling me is when they reach out, the county's going to say, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're not going to give you any paperwork of compliance because, as one of you said, we don't want the liability. In which case, nothing will change. I think the only change is going to be is when you have transactions in the CAL FIRE area. CAL FIRE is all excited about this law. And CAL FIRE says, we're ready for all these buyers to be calling us. And we're going to come out and do these inspections, and we're going to give them statements of compliance. So if you're in a CAL FIRE jurisdiction, apparently buyers are going to be able to call them up and get somebody out there and who's actually going to give them paperwork, which leads to one last question. Buyer buys the house. It's in a CAL FIRE area. In your impression, is the county coming out everywhere, even in state responsibilities area too, or are they just everywhere? Okay. See, I don't think it's going to be a big deal. In your area, it's sort of a unique situation. You've already got this county coming out. I don't even know why you even have to call CAL FIRE. Because here's another thing I asked CAL FIRE. Are you actually going to keep track of deals that close in state responsibility areas? And if you see that someone is not in compliant, are you actually going to keep a record of all deals that close and put them on some type of system? So a year from now, if a deal closed in your area, are you going to now go to this property and say, hey, buyer, you're in violation of the law. You didn't call us within a year. Are you actually going to do that? They said, nah, probably not. And then I said, well, even if you do that, and you somehow go to the property and they're in compliance, are you going to punish them because they didn't call you within a year? Or are you just going to be happy that they're in compliance? And they said, yeah, we'll probably just be happy that they're in compliance. So if you put all this together, what I'm saying to you, this is not that big of a deal. in your area because you've already got annual inspectors coming out and telling you you're not in compliance. And you've been dealing with that, and you know how to deal with that because you've been dealing with that. But for you guys though, you still have the form. The form is required. I'm your lawyer. If there's a new form you got to do, I tell you to do it. So you still pretty much all your deals in a high or very high, you're going to get the form. Your sellers are going to answer the 6 questions in paragraph 3. And you're going to not check any of the boxes in paragraph 4B, and the buyer's on their own. Then you, the buyer's agent, are going to have a conversation with your buyer, advising them what they just agreed to do. All right, I got 5 minutes. Let me tell you other things you need to know, just in case you didn't. The eviction moratorium, you understand, got extended, right? 3 more months. But it should go away then. You know why it should go? First of all, the federal got extended till the end of July, but they said that's the last time we're going to extend it. The state one got extended till end of August. I don't think it's going to get extended again. You know why? Because September 1st, the legislature is not in session. They could call them in for a special session, but I don't know. I'm thinking it's going to go away. But all you landlords need to know a couple things. This new law, this new extension that happened June 1st triggered a new form. The NTRA 3. If I'm a landlord and I have a tenant who owes me back rent for COVID that they haven't been paying, I got to give them this form by July 31st, the NTRA 3. What if I don't? Well, it's going to make it more challenging trying to evict them in the future. So point number 1, if you're a landlord, residential, in the past, you gave them the NTRA and the NTRA 2. Now there's a third one. Give the form right now to your tenants before July 31st if they owe you back rent. Do that right now by the end of the month. Second thing you need to know is, let's say, so for the next 3 months, you cannot evict them for not paying rent if they have a COVID reason. And you still can't evict them from a single family home unless you're selling the house to an owner occupying buyer, or the owner wants to move in themselves for at least a year, or you're going to take it off the rental market for at least 2 years. 3 months from now, hopefully we're going to go back to, you don't need a reason to evict someone. Unless you're in an apartment building newer than 15 years, in which case you do need some type of just cause. But for the next 2.5 months, to evict a tenant who isn't doing anything wrong, you have to have a buyer in contract to buy it and live there, or an owner wants to move in for at least a year, or take it off the market for at least 2 years. Hopefully in 2.5 months, that'll be gone. And hopefully in 2.5 months, all tenants will have to pay full rent, whether they have a COVID issue or not. First thing to remember, new form, you got new disclosure form you got to get. But here's the second interesting thing. Let's say 3 months from now, September 1st, the eviction moratorium does not get extended. Great, we're back to where we were. So I got this tenant who they're not paying me rent now. They have no more excuse to not be paying rent. I want to evict them. I want to evict them because they haven't been paying me all this rent. You're going to have to prove before you do your 3-day notice that you actually applied for rental assistance. I don't know why you wouldn't want to apply for rental assistance. The new law says landlords are now entitled to 100% reimbursement of every cent the tenant owes you. Of course, there's one catch. The catch is this is only for tenants whose current income is less than 80% of the county median income for a tenant household of that size. Let's say you have a tenant who's hasn't been paying your rent for a year. They owe you $20,000, whatever they owe you. If their current income is less than 80% of the county median for a household of that size as a tenant, the county is going to give you $20,000. What if the income of this tenant, even with COVID, is more than 80% of the area median income? County's not going to give you anything. You can sue the tenant for all the back rent, but it's a personal obligation. You can't evict them for not paying that. As long as they pay 25%. If they didn't pay 25%, come September 1st, you'll be able to evict them. But if they've been paying the 25% and not paying the 75, you'll be able to sue them for the 75, but you won't be able to sue them unless you've proven you've applied for the rental assistance. What if, and by the way, here's how you apply for the rental assistance. You go to housingiskey.com, takes you to a website. You look up San Bernardino County. It'll tell you how to fill out the application in this county. And it'll say, give us the email address of your tenant. Then they'll send an application to the tenant. What if the tenant won't fill out their application? Well, you're not going to get the money. You would think a tenant would want to send the application, because wouldn't they like their debt to be erased? Wouldn't they like the government to pay the landlord all the back rent so they don't have a debt hanging over their head? You would think they would want to comply. Let's say you file for the rental assistance, but you don't get it because they're making more than 80%, or the tenant doesn't do their part. 20 days after filing, if you've been rejected or the tenant hasn't filed their part, then you can go ahead with the eviction or sue them. But whether you want to evict or sue 3 months from now, you're going to have to prove that you attempted to get rental assistance, which means going to that website and filling out the form. If you get a rejection, if you don't hear back in 20 days, or they notify you the tenant didn't fill in their part within 20 days after, then you'll be able to do a 3-day notice. That's starting in June. So in other words, the two big things that happened that are different with this eviction moratorium are, number one, there's this new form, the NTRA 3, that every landlord who has a tenant who owes them back COVID rent must give by July 31st. Second, even when this is all over, any eviction you want to do starting September 1st all the way till March of next year. So it's not it forever, but any eviction you want to do between now and March of next 2022, you'll need to first prove that you applied for rental assistance before you can do the eviction. And as I said, I think every landlord should be applying for rental assistance. Why not? Do you want to really sue the tenant? It wouldn't be easier just to get the money from the government. So that's the big news with evictions. Okay. The other big stuff, I think you all know the rules on COVID now. Thank God you can do whatever you want like you did before COVID. The only exception is people who are unvaccinated, when they go into a showing or an open house, are supposed to wear a mask. And you can handle that on the honor system. List the age, say, hey, anyone who comes to this house, please wear a mask if you're unvaccinated. You don't have to have someone checking at the door unless that's what the seller wants. But you know what? Some sellers are going to say, to be safe, I don't want to be checking and asking people. Here's what I want. I want everyone still to wear a mask, whether they're vaccinated or not. I mean, it's their house, right? The seller's house. They can say whatever they want about their own house. They can say, you got to take off your shoes if you want to come in my house. They can say, you got to wear a mask if you come. They can say whatever they want. So sellers can require everybody wear a mask. But even if the seller doesn't, the law says unvaccinated people going into a house or an open house are supposed to wear a mask. How you enforce that, it's up to you and the seller. It could be the honor system. That's perfectly okay. What about your real estate office? Similar. Anybody who comes into your real estate office, client, agent from another office, vendor, if they're not vaccinated, they should wear a mask. Or you, the business owner, can say, I want everyone to wear a mask anyway. I'm just, to be safe, I want everyone wearing a mask. Otherwise, most of the business owners I talk to are just basically using the honor system. They're saying, they put up a sign, say, hey, if you're not vaccinated, please wear a mask. They just trust people to do the right thing. I haven't heard any that are checking people, to tell you the truth. Anyway, but one more thing you need to know as a broker. You're going to love this. Let's say you have, I've been telling you, your agents, clients, and vendors. It's very simple. They're supposed to wear a mask. You can rely on the honor system. But if you're a broker and you have a W-2 employee, I don't know if any of you have W-2 employees. I don't know if the Board of Realtors office has a W-2 employee or you have more than one person there. But all offices, not just real estate, all businesses in California right now, if you have W-2 employees who work on site, you actually have to ask them, are you vaccinated or not? And you have to keep a written record of who's vaccinated and who isn't. And once again, you have to tell them, if you're not vaccinated, that means you got to wear a mask. You can only take it off in the office if you're alone in a room or you're eating, just like a restaurant. You can take off your mask to eat. Open up your kitchen, serve food. People can take off their mask to eat. But for your agents, it's total honor system. You can treat your agents however you want. But if you have W-2 employees, you actually have to record on a piece of paper whether they're vaccinated or not. How long do you got to keep that? Nobody knows. Am I going to get audited for that? Nobody knows. Just that's what the law says. Cal OSHA says that. Okay. And I have to say this is almost amusing. Listen to this. If you have an unvaccinated W-2 employee, first of all, you don't have to allow them to come to work. You can say, get vaccinated or don't come to work. Can I work from home? No. You can let them work from home, or you can say, I need you in the office and I need you vaccinated. If you don't want to be vaccinated, you don't have to work here. You can actually do that. But anyway, you're probably going to let them work remotely. I don't know what you're going to do. But the point is, I saved the funniest part for last. It's not that funny. If you have a W-2 employee, unvaccinated, who you are allowing to work on site, they have the right to ask you, say, hey, could you supply me with an N95 mask? And the employer has to supply them one out of your own pocket. Only if they're unvaccinated, only if they ask you, and only if you're actually allowing them to work there unvaccinated. It's kind of almost amusing, isn't it? But yes, you do have a new burden as an employer of employees. You have to keep a record of your on-site employees' vaccination status. And if they request, you must give them a N95 mask. Yes, Virginia, have a non-licensed transaction assistant. They're probably an employee. But who are they an employee of? Are they an employee of the office? Are they an employee of an agent who works there? Then it gets complicated. Because if they're an employee of the agent, they're not an employee of the office. I was hoping no one's going to ask me that. So an agent wants to bring their unlicensed W-2 employee of theirs to work in the brokerage office. What's my conservative advice here? They're an employee. And you have to tell the broker what their vaccination status is. And your broker could say, no, I don't want your unvaccinated, unlicensed assistant working here. That's a business owner's right to say that, okay? And by the way, all brokers, you're still supposed to have a COVID prevention plan. Just download the one on Sierra's website. You got a plan. You're still supposed to train your people on COVID prevention practices. Just download our little training session and give it to your employees. It's pretty easy to comply with that. We still have that on our website. Hopefully, even that's going to go away soon, we hope. Hopefully, the eviction moratorium will go away in 3 months. At some point, we'll be back to normal. The FHDS is kind of a pain, but I hope I tried to simplify it for you. I think it's not a lot of what people think it is. It is a poorly written law. I'll totally admit that. And I think that's all you really definitely need to know today. Any questions on anything else in real estate you want to ask me? Feel free.
You guys can unmute yourself if you guys have any questions. You don't have to throw them in the chat now.
Yeah.
Don't all jump at once.
And by the way, I keep talking, I keep saying you can just talk, but the foreclosure moratorium was extended to the end of July 2. So starting in August, there are going to be foreclosures going forward for people, even with people with a COVID reason for not paying their mortgage. And a general comment. When you try to evict someone nowadays, it's very complicated about using the right form, because there's a certain form you have to use before September 1st. There's a different form after September 1st. There's a different form if you've applied for rental assistance or you haven't applied for rental assistance. Bottom line is this: if you are a landlord yourself, or you are getting paid as a property manager, call the legal hotline before you give someone an eviction notice to make sure you're giving them the right one. But what if you just happen to be a realtor and your client is a landlord and they start asking you, hey, I want to give my tenant a notice. What notice should I give them? Run away. Basically say, I'm not your lawyer. This stuff is crazy complicated. Please get your own legal advice. I am not going to be the one to tell you which eviction form is the right one to use. Now, hey, you want to call the hotline? We will help you. But we do not want you to be in a position of giving advice in this area and telling them what form to use, because it is. And the reason it's more complicated is because maybe not in your area, but like in LA, San Jose, San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, they have special rules in those areas where there's even more complication on what form to use. Where you guys are, if you don't have a local law, it's still, the state law is complicated enough. Anyway. Okay, someone's asking me a question directly. When should the FHDS begin? I should have addressed that. That's a good question. I think you got two choices here. Maybe it's bad to give you choices. Better just have one rule. You can just treat it as a disclosure form. Give it just like you give all the TDS and the SBC and the SPQ and the lead paint. You give them it's just a disclosure form. But remember the issue of the buyer not signing it and dealing with that. So some brokers have figured out maybe a good thing to do is to provide the FHDS as attaching it to a counteroffer, saying, I'm giving you a counteroffer here, and the counteroffer is I'm highlighting you really need to sign this form. Now, if you give it as a disclosure, they still are supposed to sign it and return it, and you can tell them that. But by putting it in a counteroffer, that maybe really opens the buyer's eyes. Oh, I really need to sign this and return it if I want this house. Because if you do it as a counteroffer and they don't sign it, they're just rejecting the counteroffer, deal's over. Whereas if you send it as a disclosure, you got to wait for them. You know, they got 7 days to, you know, they got a certain number of days to return it. You got to sort of wait to see, are they going to return it or not? And you don't cancel the deal until they return it, right? Whereas if you do it as a counter offer, you know right away whether the buyer is agreeing to it or not. So they don't sign it, they've rejected the counter, move on to the next buyer. Whereas if you do it as a disclosure, you got to wait for their response, and you're waiting, are they going to sign it or not? And you know what I mean? You're sort of delaying things. So I think it's sort of your call as a listing agent, whether you want to provide this with all the other disclosures, or if I want a quick answer as to whether they're going to sign it or not, just do it as attach it to a counter, make it part of a counter. That's a very good question. Okay, any more?
I don't have any on my side.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you. This
My
meeting was
pleasure.
wonderful.